Materialism, the worldview that physical matter is the only reality, or that matter is a fundamental substance in nature, and that all phenomena, including thoughts, feelings, emotions, consciousness, and intent, can be explained in terms of material interactions. Today, philosophical physicalism, the view that all that exists in reality is ultimately physical, has replaced materialism as the leading philosophical worldview held within mainstream Western science, so I will cover physicalism in detail in the next video. So, what is matter? Well, it turns out that three key developments during the 20th century transformed matter into one of the most elusive concepts ever: the classical idea of particles of matter possessing properties such as extension, shape, density, location, momentum, or impenetrability started to dissolve. The first blow came from the theories of special and general relativity. Matter and energy were suddenly brought into a kind of equivalence, famously described by Einstein's equation E=mc², which described the fact that rest mass could be converted into massless radiation and vice versa. Physicists began to understand that there was no fundamental ontological division between matter and energy. In addition, mass was no longer the only measure of gravitational agency. Now, a photon, for instance, despite having zero rest mass, could exert a gravitational force thanks to its kinetic energy. Both mass and energy could affect space and time. They could cause the local warping of space-time, which was no longer Euclidean. Einstein's equation forced us to redefine the concept of matter. Matter, somehow, had begun to dematerialize. The second blow to classical materialism was brought by quantum physics. The discovery that light could behave both as a wave and as a particle was soon followed by the discovery that particles of matter could also behave as a wave. Astonishingly, a particle would not behave as a particle unless a measurement was made. Unobserved properties of particles were described by probability waves, which seem to describe a world of potentiality, whereas observing the properties of particles seemed to be the process which was bringing this potentiality into actuality. As Werner Heisenberg put it, the probability wave was a quantitative version of the old concept of potentia in Aristotelian philosophy. It introduced something standing in the middle between the idea of an event and the actual event, a strange kind of physical reality just in the middle between possibility and reality. Here's another quote from him that I quite like. The ontology of materialism rested upon the illusion that the kind of existence, the direct actuality of the world around us, can be extrapolated into the atomic range. This extrapolation, however, is impossible. Atoms are not things. The uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics forbids particles of matter from possessing definite positions and momenta at the same time. The same uncertainty principle also applies to the pair energy-time, for instance, which allows the energy of the vacuum to fluctuate in such a way that unobservable virtual particles can pop in and out of existence all the time. What we call empty space, as Lawrence Krauss puts it, is actually a boiling, bubbling brew of virtual particles that pop in and out of existence in a time scale so short that we can't even measure them. So we see that the concept of matter not only started to dematerialize due to the energy-mass equivalence, but now it seemed to vanish altogether due to the wave-like properties of particles, the intrinsic indeterminacy in nature, and the fact that particles did not seem to act like material particles at all unless their properties were brought into actuality by the act of measurement. Not to mention the fact that we also discovered that atoms really are not much else than empty space. A hydrogen atom, for instance, is about 99.99999999996% empty space. If a hydrogen atom was the size of the Earth, the proton at its center would only be about 200 meters across, not what can be called a very substantial object by any stretch of the imagination. The third blow to the concept of matter came from quantum field theory. In this model, material particles can only be understood as the properties of an underlying field, a field which manifests differently at different points in space-time. In Sean Carroll's words, quantum field theory is a very simple idea. Everything is fields. There is no such thing as particles. Particles are what you see when you look at fields very, very closely. I like how physicist Bernard Despagnat elegantly and artfully explains the ideas behind quantum field theory. He writes, "Let us begin by observing that the notion of creation is not a scientific one. We do not know how to capture it, and even less quantify it. It is therefore appropriate to reduce it to something we can master. Now, we do master the notion of a system state and changes thereof." The breakthrough just came from this. It consisted in considering that the existence of a particle is a state of a certain something, that the existence of two particles is another state of this same something, and so on. Of course, the absence of a particle is also a state of this something. Then the creation of a particle is nothing else than a transition from one state of this something to another state of this something. True, the problem of the real nature of the something is an inordinately delicate one. Classical science favored a conception of nature in which basic reality, matter as it was called, was constituted of a myriad of simple elements, essentially localized atoms or particles embedded in fields and hence interacting by means of forces decreasing when distance increased. On the other hand, quantum field theory is radically at variance with it. Not only it is true that, in it, the particles no longer play the role of the constitutive material of the universe. What is more, the only entity that, in it, might conceivably be thought to constitute basic reality is the something, of which we saw that it is fundamentally the only one of its species. I find it fascinating that quantum field theory is based on the idea that reality, at its core, is ultimately just this one thing, that matter emerges from something that we can't even begin to comprehend, even less describe, that this something, by its nature, is in fact indescribable. Some scientists, like Lawrence Krauss for instance, like to call it nothing, in what looks like a somewhat childish attempt to establish a clear difference between the irrational idea of a god or creator and the of course perfectly reasonable idea of a natural process whereby things simply pop out of utter nothingness. Turns out that, upon close examination, it is quite clear that Lawrence Krauss's use of the word nothing is rather ambiguous, that in no way this nothingness denotes the absence of anything, nor it describes a state of utter non-existence. It is actually very interesting to see the parallels between the way current science is trying to describe this nothingness, attempting to explain the creation of something from nothing, and the way humanity has tried to explain these same concepts in Eastern philosophical traditions such as Buddhism, Taoism, or Hinduism. The concept of nothingness in Buddhism, for instance, is usually translated as emptiness, but this emptiness is not emptiness in the negative sense of the word. It is positive emptiness. It means no-thingness, and it signifies the ultimate reality, not in the sense of being a separate reality, but in the sense of being the ultimate truth about our existence. The state of emptiness has no names, no attributes, no qualities, no differentiation. It is ineffable, formless, meaning it cannot be described in any terms at all. It cannot be conceptualized. It cannot be objectified. It precedes differentiation. It precedes form. So, modern physics tells us that from this undifferentiated something, from this no-thing we can't even name, everything else arises. That this undifferentiated something, this no-thing, not only precedes but also gives rise to matter and everything else. The idea that matter is the ultimate reality has been completely crushed by modern physics models. There are innumerable experiments which further confirm this dematerialization of what we used to think of as matter. Think of the phenomenon of quantum tunneling, for instance. What we like to call a material particle and tend to think of it as going through a classically impenetrable wall. Nothing like that, in fact. The fascinating thing is that neither the supposed material particle can be said to follow a defined trajectory, nor can it be said to travel through the wall. No, it turns out that the so-called material particle simply disappears from one side of the wall and then magically reappears on the other side, without having to physically cross the barrier. And then, of course, came the ideas of dark matter and dark energy, not to mention the ideas behind string theory, which describe matter as nothing but the vibration of invisible, unmeasurable strings. It seems to me that this process of dematerialization of matter is exposing not much else than an empty reality behind it all. Empty in the positive sense of the word, of course. It is showing that the only things we have left to cling onto in modern science are nothing but our own conceptual, abstract ideas, which, for better or worse, are the only tools we have left when it comes to describing the immateriality of that which we cannot directly measure, the immateriality of that which seems to appear out of nowhere. It is unquestionable that, over the past century or so, the concept of matter has morphed into something that cannot be said to have the properties of matter at all, by any stretch of the imagination. The irony of it all is that our everyday experience of solidity, extension, or locality fools us into assuming that matter is in fact the ultimate reality. Undoubtedly, many cultural, philosophical, religious, technological, economical, and social events have influenced Western society to continue clinging on to the ideology of materialism for such a long time, despite the advances of modern physics. Perhaps it is time to start letting go once and for all. Time for the West to start looking at reality through a different, more mature lens. I will leave you with these thoughts. If when we look for matter, we end up finding nothing but emptiness, could it be that matter is nothing more than our own subjective experience of solidity, extension, and locality? What if matter is just a conceptual construction derived from a familiar experience within consciousness? Perhaps the ultimate reality is indeed just this indescribable, undifferentiated somethingness, or shall we say this no-thing-ness, this void, this emptiness, this realm of formless, unbounded potentiality, a realm from which all experiences and forms ultimately arise, including our own conscious experience, including our own conceptualization of this immaterial thing we love to call matter. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so. Currently, Crack in the Nutshell cannot survive without some extra help. If you enjoy what I do and would like to give me a reward for my work, I would kindly ask you to consider donating. For a one-off donation using PayPal, just go to crackinthenutshell/donate. On the other hand, if you would like to become my patron and contribute as much or as little as you want, rewarding me for each video that I create, while still having the freedom to set a maximum monthly amount should you want to do so, just go and check out my new Patreon page at patreon.com/crackinthennutshell. Again, thank you ever so much for your support. It means the world to me. It really does. See you all very, very soon.